Okay, great. So you're all very welcome to the third talk. It's a gorgeous day here. I've had to close the curtains beside me. It's so bright outside. So well done for sitting looking at a screen instead. Okay, so I'm going to perhaps be a bit what's the word? Reckless. And I'm going to talk probably a bit longer. I'm going to talk about probably about 40 minutes or so today about the myth of self-discovery. That's my guess. It might be less. It might be a little more. Just to recap what we've done so far. So we've looked at a couple of the myths. We've looked at the myth of self-development, which is where I become the Buddha. The Buddha is outside of us and we're working towards Buddhahood. And we're working to close that gap through our efforts between where we are now and our potential as embodied in, say, the Buddha or something like that. And then we had a superb talk as well last night from Sadhya Sihi about self-surrender. Atulyamitra gave us a really good introduction to self-development yesterday, and last night Sadhya Sihi talked to us about self-surrender. So this is where, in a way, the Buddha comes down and becomes us, and we have the image of falling in love with enlightenment and opening up to the beloved and allowing it to flow through us, you could say, speaking poetically again. And each of these myths have strengths and weaknesses, fronts and backs. And I'll probably speak a bit more about that tomorrow morning in the final session about how they can all complement each other. Although I'm sure we'll probably hear about it a bit tonight in the conversation with Jyotika and Yaneshwari as well. So today we're moving on then to the myth of self-discovery. And this is something new again. This is where the Buddha erupts from within us. It's where our own deepest nature is already Buddhahood. And awakening is less to do with trying to get somewhere or open to something outside of us, but it's more about becoming aware that enlightenment is already within and it's our natural state. So it's quite a poetic myth with dangers and with strengths. So I want to go through all these kinds of things in this talk. So with self-discovery, the Dharma becomes less about moving towards something and more about getting yourself out of the way, so that qualities that are already latent, at least within you, can more fully emerge. Subhuti and Maitreya Bandhu and Yanavacha, they're the main talks we're drawing a lot of this material from. They've broken this kind of into two different ways. One is that you search for within yourself for this truth, and through your efforts kind of allow it to come to the fore more and more. And you could call that self-discovery proper, but you could also have a kind of maybe a subcategory of self-discovery, which is emergence, which is where you really just get out of the way. And the more fully you get out of the way, the more fully these qualities can shine. And in a way, they'll reveal themselves without effort. But we're just going to talk about self-discovery anyway. We'll just call it both self-discovery. And whichever way you look at it, the general understanding is that by seeing that your true nature is enlightenment, it can have a really profound and encouraging and beautiful effect on how you look at the Dharma life and how you relate to yourself as well. So I want to talk a bit then about where this comes from in the Buddhist tradition, because in a way, its development within the Buddhist tradition probably mirrors a bit of how we'll uncover it as well a bit in our own Dharma lives. But like all the three myths, all the three myths are there in the very early stages of Buddhism. And one of the famous lines in the Pali Canon, is the really old texts that we have describing the Buddha's life and his main teachings. In one of them called the Anguttara Nikaya, there's a famous line which says, "The mind is radiant and it is covered by adventitious defilements." The mind is radiant and it is covered by adventitious defilements. So if you're like me and the first time you come across this, you don't know what adventitious means, fear not. So adventitious means to do with things external to you rather than something intrinsic to you. So to do with things that are outside of you by nature rather than something essential to you. So what it's saying is that the mind is radiant, is naturally radiant, but it gets covered over by stuff from outside, you could say, stuff from outside itself. And again, that's quite a poetic way of looking at the mind. With all, I think with self-surrender and self-discovery, you have to be careful of literalism. So I see he warned us about that last night, didn't she, about the dangers of literalism. And it's particularly true as well here of the self-discovery, but I'll come back to that later on. So this idea of chitta, of mind being radiant, was further developed and brought out in Zen, in Vajrayana Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism. It was particularly brought to the fore in what's called the Tathagatagarbha doctrine. There's a lot of T's in there, so if you're trying to spell it, Tathagatagarbha. And Tathagatagarbha is a Mahayana school, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, don't worry about it. The word means the womb of enlightenment, the womb of enlightenment. And the bedrock text for this is the Tathagatagarbha Sutra. So sutra is just in a way, I think it means thread, but it's a text basically. And this text, even though it's had a huge effect on the Buddhist tradition, the later Buddhist tradition, it's quite simple actually. It's a series of 9 or so images for what the mind is truly like, yeah? And all of these images, I'll say a few of them in a few minutes, but all of these images communicate the potential for enlightenment hidden within us, but just covered over by adventitious defilements, by, well, traditionally they're called the kleshas. So the kleshas, K-L-E-S-A-S. Kleshas are deep-rooted volitional tendencies, are deep-rooted habitual tendencies towards greed, hatred, and delusion. So underneath these kleshas, which aren't intrinsic to us in some ways, there is something deeper and purer and richer. So one of the wonderful things about Buddhism is that it's really, really clear that we can all become Buddhas. We can all become Buddhas, yeah? So regardless of our backgrounds, regardless of our gender, regardless of our race, regardless of our education, regardless of our social class, we can all become Buddhas, yeah? So it's a really, really powerful, this myth of self-discovery, this way of looking at existence is a really, really positive and powerful way of looking at things, yeah? That within everyone, even that person who just feels like they've been put on this earth to annoy you, they have Buddhahood as their deepest nature, yeah? And it's a really important, this is a really important aspect of Buddhism to remember this. And within the myth of self-discovery, what we're trying to do is we're trying to eliminate the ignorance that prevents us from seeing this reality, that prevents us from seeing our bigger mind, our higher consciousness, our Buddha nature, whatever term for it you want to use. And what we have most in common with all other people is that they too have Buddha nature just like us. They are potentially Buddhas, but it's just temporarily covered over right now. Now, in terms of the philosophy of this, I mean, I think you have to be careful of approaching this myth as rational philosophy. In a way, Subhuti makes the point that we need to think of this more as poetic philosophy. So the Tathagatagarbha Sutra talks about these beautiful images for what our deepest nature is like, but offers no way of working out how to do that in some ways. It is a poetic evocation. But it arose within the Buddhist tradition because it's impossible to really read any school of Buddhism without reading everything that came before it in a way. The whole history of Buddhism has been a development on what went before. And the reason that the Tathagatagarbha doctrine or teachings came so much to the fore was that before it was, this is very, very broad brushstrokes, obviously, but before it, what was the dominant school in Buddhism in India was the Madhyamaka. And the Madhyamaka was a brilliant school of Buddhism that reduced everything to emptiness. So if you heard the Heart Sutra last night that Pavra was chanting, well, we're all chanting, but we were listening to Pavra chanting, it's basically saying that any ideas you have about reality are wrong. And reality is beyond any kind of description. And any idea you have about enlightenment is just an idea. And enlightenment is completely beyond the mind's grasp of understanding. So it's not this, it's not that. You can talk about the Four Noble Truths, you can talk about the end of suffering, but actually they're just ideas for something that's much more mysterious. And it's very much into rational analysis. And I think the school is quite brilliant. I'm not long back from a solitary retreat where I was doing a lot of I guess I'd say Majamica inspired reflections. So seeing the emptiness of craving and how it just arises in dependence upon conditions, seeing the emptiness of all kinds of things, even perceptions that we have are kind of empty, looked at it from a certain kind of way. But if that's all one had, if that's all one had to reflect upon, I think it would be, it could easily descend into nihilism and that nothing is there. And I felt, even though I really appreciated this particular book I was reading by a teacher called Rob Berbea, I was so happy that I was in this order where we have this really strong emphasis on recollecting the Buddha, devotion to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas like Siddhayasihi was like. It was so much easier to do those reflections within the context of, well, being in love with enlightenment, to use Siddhayasihi's term. So this kind of idea of Buddha nature and Tathagarbha arose out of a perceived need to kind of express positively what enlightenment was like again, rather than just what it wasn't. Yeah. So to give you a sense of, but it was always very clear to say that this sense of Buddha nature is empty too. But anyways, maybe that's more detail than we need to go into right now. So to give you a sense of the ideas or the images given in the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, here's a few of them. Some of them are quite lovely. So it's saying that our true nature is like these. So our true nature is like honey covered by bees. Yeah. So I don't know if you've ever seen those pictures of beehives where there's so many bees that you can't see what's in it, but underneath is the honey. Yeah. It's like wheat kernel in the husk. Yeah. It's like gold hidden in waste. Well, it uses a more impolite term, but waste is the best term for it, yeah. Here's the quote. Suppose that gold belonging to a man on his travels had fallen into a place of stinking dirt. As it is indestructible by nature, it would stay there for many hundreds of years. So even though, according to traditional Buddhism, we've traversed this world through many, many lifetimes, the gold is always there hidden underneath. Yeah, no matter what we've done. Continuing on the images, it's like treasure under a house. It's like a sprout in a seed becoming a huge tree. So when you look at a sprout, who would have thought that it could become this massive tree, for example? It's like a statue hidden in rags. And I think my favorite one is this last one, which is that it's a golden Buddha buried within its clay mold. So I'm not a sculptor or anything, but you know, if you have a mold and you can make this beautiful, you pour in the liquid gold and you make this beautiful statue. And the mold itself is probably quite ugly, but then you crack the mold open and you end up with this beautiful statue. So that's what our deepest nature is like, if we could just let go of the coverings, the kleshas that we do. So once we can let go of greed, hatred, and delusion, this golden statue that is our true nature, this honey at the center of the beehive, this gold, this treasure, this wheat kernel can freely emerge then. So that's what self-discovery is ultimately saying. I will go into more practical examples of this in a few minutes, yeah, if that's still a little abstract to you. The sutra also says that this state, you know, the seeing things in this way, in the ultimate sense, can be approached only by faith. For those who have no eyes cannot see the blazing disk of the sun. It can only be approached by faith. For those who have no eyes cannot see the blazing disk of the sun. So again, it's quite a beautiful image. That we do need the other myths. We do need a degree of confidence and faith, like Siddhayasihi was talking about last night, to have faith in our own true nature. Yeah. Another image that really works for me, and this is I'm sure it's a traditional image, but I can't remember. I've connected with it for so many years now. I can't remember quite where I've heard it first. But the image I have is that of a stream. Yeah. So I grew up in Settlers Common on a farm, and outside my house there was a lovely stream that used to flow past. And I remember as a kid being endlessly fascinated by this, you know, the flow and the shape of water in the stream, very clear, clean water. And it was only maybe, I don't know, a foot deep at most, you know, but I remember playing in it and being fascinated by it and trying to dam it up and throw stones into it. I'm sure many of you have done that as well. And whenever I think of this kind of self-discovery myth, I think this is the image that comes to mind, is that of a stream. The mind is, our deepest nature is like an ever-flowing, ever-changing stream. And when we do acts of greed, acts of hatred, acts of delusion, it's as if we're pouring in food dye into the stream. Yeah, so we're clouding the clarity of the stream. And instead of this beautiful, clear stream that's limpid and vibrant and everything, we have a muddy looking kind of a mix of all different colors. Yeah. And so the reason I like that image is that it's active. We're actively pouring in food dyes into the stream. We're actively doing greed, hatred, and delusion. And the message, of course, then is that if we stop doing greed, hatred, and delusion, if we stop pouring the food dyes into the stream will naturally run clear. The mind will naturally run clear. Yeah. So all we need to do with self-discovery in some ways is just really deeply learn how to stop doing the kleshas, stop doing these deeply unhelpful habits. Enlightenment is already there to be accessed. Our minds will naturally run free and clear if we can just in a way get out of the way. Yeah. So hopefully you can see how incredibly positive a vision this is of the mind. I was brought up a Catholic, and the dominating kind of myth in some ways of our deepest nature is that of original sin. And for me, this is such a contrast to that our minds will naturally run clear if we just give it the right conditions. The main way, I'm not going to talk about this for too long, but the main way I think for me self-discovery works is in terms of the lakshanas. So many of you will have heard of the lakshanas. The lakshanas are a very, very ancient Buddhist teaching going right back to the Buddha that says that, slightly simplified, that all things that we experience in the world are impermanent. They're ever changing. All things we experience are without any kind of fixed essence to them. And all worldly things are free of, well, they don't have the ability to give us lasting satisfaction. Yeah. No matter how seductive they are, we will always end up being unsatisfied with them. So when I'm reflecting on these, I feel like I'm engaging with the myth of self-discovery. What I'm doing is I'm letting go of my attachments to things being fixed, which is one of the coverings that prevent the stream from running clear. When I'm letting go of my desire for feeling the security of a fixed essence in myself or in the world around me, I'm letting go of those food dyes. I'm letting go of those things which cover over my deepest nature. It gets in the way. And when I'm letting go of my idea that if I have this or if I have that, I'll be happy and complete, when I can really see that those things are actually unsatisfactory, the mind will run clear. Yeah, the mind will run clear. My bigger mind will be able to manifest when it's not preoccupied with these more smaller things, you could say. So the myth of self-discovery is like clearing away this briar patch in our minds. And the briars are not seeing the lakshanas, not seeing the impermanence, not seeing the insubstantial nature of things, not seeing the unsatisfactory nature of things. And that underneath the briar patch is this golden Buddha. Or again, I think the stream is a better one because in a way, it's a bit more suggestive of how we're actively contributing to what gets in the way of us seeing the golden statue of our deepest nature. Okay. So that's the myth. I want to talk a bit about the strengths and the weaknesses then of the myth. And then I'll say a couple of more applications. So I think one of the biggest reasons this myth is useful to people is that it can get us out of the back of self-development. So sometimes with self-development, we can feel like it's an endless battle to work with our negativities. It's an endless battle to work with our habits. We never have enough mindfulness. We never have enough metta. No matter how much we do, we still keep coming up against how short and how far away we are from Buddhahood. Yeah. And it's that despair in some ways that Atulyamitra talked about, that kind of feeling like no matter how much I do, I never seem to make progress, which can happen really with self-development, particularly as you've been practicing it for longer. So self-discovery moves us away from being stuck in that kind of mindset, that kind of problem-orientated mindset, and realizing that, to help us realize that our true nature is only a breath away. Yeah. and our natural nature is already metta, is already generosity, is already kindness, is already awareness, and so on. The next strength of this myth or way of looking at practice is that it emphasizes that liberation is possible here and now. Yeah, it emphasizes that here and now. And it also emphasizes the importance of trying to gain enlightenment here and now. Yeah, one of the things that we can do is we can postpone liberation for the sake of just being a bit more ethical and a bit more kind. Yeah, we can forget about the bigger perspective of what we're really trying to do, which is to gain enlightenment. And I think this is particularly important if you're, ironically, if you're an altruistic person, if you're very, very active in trying to help the world. Yeah, I think this is a real danger that people who work in centers and Shiratna institutions can fall into, order members especially, where, you know, you just get so caught up in very, very goodly work that you forget that it's actually about enlightenment as well. Yeah. And instead it's about just trying to do more and more goodly work, and goodly work is endless. Yeah. And ultimately we can't perfect samsara actually. So we do need to keep an eye on enlightenment as well. So this myth re-emphasizes the importance of liberation as well. You could meditate and do good works until the end of time. If you approach it in the wrong way, you might still never gain enlightenment. Yeah. The next advantage of this myth is that while it can feel abstract in some ways, and it can get quite heady, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, it is very empirical as well, actually. You can try it out for yourself. So one of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, well, the Buddha has this teaching of the Four Noble Truths, and in a way, self-discovery is there. So the Four Noble Truths are, well, there is dissatisfaction, there is suffering. Suffering arises in dependence upon craving, wanting things, in particular wanting things to be other than they are. If we stop doing craving, we will stop experiencing dukkha. We will stop experiencing this unsatisfactoriness. And then the path is the Noble Eightfold Path to be able to do that. So I think the myth in self-discovery is when you're experiencing dukkha next time, ask yourself, what is the craving that's giving a rise to this? And kind of just stop doing that, you know? And then you can test for yourself, well, does that lead to a reduction in your dukkha? You know, does something else manifest more? And I mean, this might be a little difficult to see if you're very new to Buddhism, but if you have any momentum of practice, I think one can do that. Even as newcomers, one can see that. It's very direct. I mean, like I said, I was on solitary and I was reflecting on this. And one of the things I was reflecting on is, I was reading about as well, is our sense of time arises in dependence upon craving. And if we stop doing craving, we stop having a sense of past, present, and future. And we can simply live in something which I don't even want to call the now, because even that puts too much of a label on it. But I was just really, really looking and doing lots of meditation, looking quite subtly at how so much of what I want is future orientated or past orientated, and wanting something in the future or wanting to get away from something in the past or something like that. And when I stopped doing that, without even having to do anything else, I just found myself so utterly in an experience of timelessness. I don't think I've ever had such a strong experience of timelessness on that retreat as on that retreat. I even hesitate to call it present moment experience, because in a way, even calling it present isn't quite the right word. It's just being outside of time. It's not that, you know, things run backwards or anything like that if you're, you know, like used to watching Star Trek episodes or something. It's more that you just have a sense of timelessness, and you don't even think in terms of past, present, and future. And I think that again, and that wasn't something that I could or should or even would be able to bring into being on its own. It's more that when I stopped the craving, that naturally came into play, that naturally came into being. So that's self-discovery as well. So it's empirical. It's empirical. Yeah, you can try it out for yourself. Now, self-discovery does have some quite strong backs. Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of our community, was very, very reticent to emphasize this myth. He was quite concerned about what are very serious backs to it, yeah? And so you do have to be careful as well. I don't want to problematize it, but you do have to be quite wary as well of the backs. The main one they're all kind of linked, actually, to be honest. But the main one is that the myth of self-discovery can easily undermine a sense of the path. So let me explain what I mean by that. So it can undermine the path, and if you undermine a sense of the path in Buddhism, you undermine everything, just to say. So when you're talking about self-discovery, you're usually talking about things from the point of view of enlightenment. You're talking about things from the point of view of the ultimate. Your innermost essence is completely pure, for example, you know? And it's easy to mistake the goal for the path, yeah? So if you feel like you're already in enlightenment, you can easily get into the state of thinking, well, there's nothing to do then. There's nothing to attain. And in some poetic senses, that is true. You know, again, remember I said it was a poetic philosophy rather than a rational philosophy here. But practically what tends to happen, and I've seen this happen, it's not an abstract fear of mine, is that people get into the story that, well, you know, they have an experience of something, which is very positive, but then they think that, well, all I need to do now is just do nothing and sit with this. And they take the foot off the pedal. And they can even get into a story that the path is just willful striving, and actually all acts of will just get in the way of this allowing something to unfold. And it tends to lead to, this might be a bit controversial, but I think it's particularly a danger for young men who get into this myth, who are quite heady. I certainly fell into it a little bit when there was a big craze about pure awareness when I was first getting involved. And it can lead you into a kind of a semi-alienated, overly rational, overly intellectual approach to the Dharma. Yeah. And I think that's the second danger that I want to mention, that it can lead you to ending up mistaking intellectual understandings for actual insight. Yeah, so you can mistake intellectual understandings of this myth for actual insight. So yeah, again, like I say, you can think that, well, you have some experience of, wow, all I needed to do was stop doing that craving, and now I'm in experience of timelessness. So then you think that, well, all I have to do then is just sit here and do nothing. Yeah. And actually, I would say that you can only really, and the other thing that tends to happen then is you get into like reading non-dual teachers, especially from Vedanta and so on. That's when I really get worried about people, and they usually end up in an awful kind of muddle, unless they have a very, very good grounding already in right view in Buddhism. But for this reason, I think this myth will naturally best emerge quite naturally out of an already existing practice of self-discovery and self-development and self-surrender. Self-development helps us to become more integrated and positive. It tends to bring together all the different persons that we are into one person walking one path. We had a really interesting discussion in our group yesterday where someone was talking about how, you know, the teachings on no self that you see in Buddhism, in some ways, they were saying they need to have more of a self. And I think they were dead right, that in some ways we need to have more of a self together so that then we can see through that self, or at least see through our attachment to that self. Because if you have lots of different selves, well, you might see through one and think that you're there, but then there's all these other selves in you still running riot, you know? And you're likely to end up with a purely intellectual understanding that you tend to get quite attached to then as well. There's usually a lot of attachment, ironically. Some of the people who I've seen who get caught up in this can be the most self-obsessed people I've ever met, actually. Again, maybe being a bit controversial there. Nobody present, I'm sure. And self-surrender then is useful because self-surrender helps us realize that it helps to take us beyond self-intoxication. Instead, we start looking outward against the Buddha out there. So I think self-development and self-surrender, kind of self-discovery can come out of those very, very well. And those other two myths balance the backs of this myth. And indeed, ultimately, true self-discovery involves seeing that out there and in here are concepts anyway, and there's something richer than that. The next back of, there's a few backs of this myth. The next one is that self-discovery can easily undermine ethics, or can be used to justify unskillfulness. Yeah. So it can lead to what's called antinomianism. So antinomianism is where we're not bound by moral laws or observances because some higher principle or power tell us that it's okay, that tells us that it's okay not to. So the classic example maybe in Europe would be different forms of Christianity feeling like God is on their side and telling them to wipe the other ones out, you know? So instead of following thou shalt not kill, well, you're given permission by God to kill people, yeah? But you also have it in Buddhism as well. In Buddhism, how it tends to manifest is that, well, it's all Buddha nature anyway, it's all mind anyway, so there's no one really being killed. Yeah, and you literally had this in World War II, apparently, with Zen priests blessing kamikaze pilots, saying that it's all but a mind anyway. Nobody's being killed or killing, you know. And there's a movement in Japanese Buddhism called, I think it's called critical Buddhism, but it's really looking at the moment at why Zen lends itself to this tendency. And it is like self-discovery is the dominant myth in Zen. So this is looking at that back. So any justification of unskillfulness is very dubious. And you do get this at a more everyday level. You know, people who often get into this myth in an immature way, well, you know, it's all mind anyway, so it's fine if I get drunk. It's fine if I go out partying. You know, it's all part of the play of my deeper mind, and, you know, nothing can sully my Buddha nature. I've even met an order member, I've even knew of an order member who said that, well, it's all mind anyway, so it's okay to eat meat. And he was saying this in classes in a Buddha center, not the Dublin Buddha Center. And I remember someone else saying about, well, you know, if you're in a state of pure awareness, well, you could kill someone and there'd be no karmic consequences to that, you know? So I think you have to watch out for these kind of shallow understandings of self-discovery. I think the Tibetan tradition has been very aware of this tendency and danger, and it is a real danger in a lot of later Buddhism. And Padmasambhava, who Siddhaya talked about last night, had a wonderful saying. He said, we should descend with the view and ascend with the conduct. So we should descend with the view and ascend with the conduct. And what he meant by that is that we need to bring the view of self-discovery of Buddha nature down into our lives. But we need to make sure that we bring the bedrock of ethics up as high as we go in the Dharma life. Yeah, so you never go beyond acting ethically. Descend with the view and ascend with the conduct. So I think it's a really beautiful saying, I have to say. So one last back. I think self-discovery is the dominant myth, maybe not the dominant myth, but it's a myth that is very easily appropriated by, I hesitate to even say modern, but even postmodern world. It can tend to support a particular type of modern nihilism. So in modern times, there's a mood of skepticism about objective truths being out there. And instead, there's a tendency to think that, well, I have my truth, and that's the truth, and nobody can question that. And you have your truth, and that person is their truth, and all are equally valid. Yeah. And because this truth is within us, we don't need supportive conditions around us. We don't need spiritual friends. We don't need Sangha. We have all the wisdom that we need inside us already. Yeah. And again, I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen with people, and they've ended up being very, very muddled. I mean, I think again, this is just an immature approach to this myth. I think this myth is really, really useful, but this is an immature approach to this myth. And I think what you're doing here is, instead of placing your deepest Buddha nature at the center of your mandala, at the center of your practice, in terms of saying that's what it is, you're actually just putting your own whims there. You know, your own whims, your own everyday self is what you're venerating, yeah, rather than your deepest Buddha nature. Okay, so these are some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses, some of the backs of self-discovery. So I wanted to talk a little bit then just about how we might apply this, and that'll be pretty much it then. So I just wanted to speak briefly about just sitting, and I wanted to speak briefly about the hindrances in meditation. So I was asking my Trikaya to do a bit longer just sitting this morning. I don't know if you noticed. He was going to do it anyway, actually. But I think just sitting is a really interesting practice, and it is a practice that very much embodies the myth of self-discovery. So what we're trying to do in just sitting is letting go of a certain kind of activity that we do. We allow something to unfold in our experience that's already present without particularly directing it by force of will. Yeah. So the way I approach just sitting anyway, is that we practice a certain kind of disidentification with what's going on in our minds, with what's going on in our sense experience. And by disidentification, I'm just really clear. So I don't mean a cutting off from. I really don't mean a cutting off from. You're vividly in touch with the contents of your mind. You're vividly in touch with your sense information, your sense experience, but you're not tight about them. You're not clinging onto them. You're not holding onto them. You're not caught up in them. You're not lost in the stories that they're telling you. You're simply with them, allowing them to play out, but without, if there is effort, it's simply staying with them, experiencing them, feeling them, and watching them play out without being lost in them. And that's what I tend to do with just sitting. And then letting go of tensions, letting go of holding on, relaxing, opening to a kind of a more energetic feel of the body. I think one of the skills we need to do as meditators is open to the energetic body, open to a sense of our body as energy flow, as emotional flow, as mental flow of energy, rather than just skin and bones and sinew and muscle and so on. And you could say that the mantra of just sitting, not that you're chanting a mantra particularly, although it might be useful to say it, is that it's not me, it's not mine, I'm not identifying with this, or I'm not clinging to this. So it's not me, it's not mine, I'm not identifying with this. Yeah, you're feeling it, but not identifying with it. And that is a bit of a skill that one has to learn as well, how to feel something without getting overly identified with it. Well, without getting identified with it at all. So we do this in just sitting, and we disidentify, in the very positive sense of that word, with our experience, with any sense of me doing something. And what tends to open up then, particularly on retreat where you have a chance to, we also need a certain kind of momentum here of mindfulness and metta usually to do this. But what opens up is a vast spacious awareness, which we also don't identify with. Yeah. And no matter what arises, we continue not to identify with that. And we become aware of this without clinging to it. And you could say that this awareness almost becomes what we're aware of. And without any kind of sense of it being my awareness, there's just awareness, you could say. And we can even go beyond a strong sense of subject and object here. We can even go beyond a sense of kind of linear time, like I was saying earlier, or space. And we can even experience just sitting as being full of Buddha qualities, being full of love, being full of wisdom, being full of emotional positivity, being full of energy, and so on. And all we're doing really is we're opening up and letting this manifest in just sitting. So hopefully you can see how just sitting very strongly embodies the myth of self-discovery. And we should all be doing just sitting. At the end of every sit, we should be doing just sitting, you know. And as you meditate more, particularly on retreat, I think you can start to introduce more just sitting. And you could I mean, I think one generally tends to need the support of some mindfulness and some metta, but particularly on retreat, you could try and do more and more just sitting with your experience. But it won't really happen, I think, without self-discovery at play and without self-surrender at play as well. So that's just sitting. And then the second application of self-discovery that's quite practical for us is approaching the hindrances. So Sadhya Sihi mentioned the hindrances yesterday, and she was talking about them in terms of self-development. And I wanted to bring this conversation a bit further then in terms of the perspective of self-discovery. So the word, as she said yesterday, is nivaranas. So the 5 hindrances, you know, sense, desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and anxiety, doubt and indecision. These are the nivaranas. And the better translation is coverings. So we use the word hindrances, but the word hindrance isn't always very satisfying, because a hindrance can almost make it too real. It can make it feel like something we have to get around, something we have to blast out of the way, something we have to avoid. It can give it a weight that it doesn't need to give them sometimes. So I think coverings is a better word. And if you're familiar with the Heart Sutra, well, maybe not I don't think it's in the translation that we use, but it talks about a bodhisattva, an advanced spiritual being, is free of chitta varanaha. And I think that's the same word, mind coverings. So because a bodhisattva is free of mind coverings, they're enlightened. Yeah. So here, using the myth of self-discovery, we approach hindrances as coverings, something that is just simply covering over what is innate to us. And what we're trying to do, instead of, sometimes I think you have to be a little bit careful with this, but sometimes I think we take the hindrances a bit too seriously. Yeah, we get too caught up in the story that they tell us. We get too caught up in the reality they're presenting to us, and it's not really a reality. We take them too personally. We problematize them and so on. And sometimes it's enough just to say, okay, there's a covering. I'm not going to get too worked up about it, and just let it be there among all the other things in my experience, and eventually it'll dissipate. Yeah. So obviously this might not work if you're in intense murderous ill will or something like that. You know, you'll have to use the traditional antidotes, which I won't go into here. But this is obviously, for those of you who know the antidotes, this is the blue sky approach to hindrances. So you might find it useful to think more in terms of coverings rather than hindrances. Osada will probably be saying a bit more about this approach in meditation. Osada will be saying a bit more about this approach in meditation this afternoon at 3:30 as well. So anyways, these are the myths. This is the myth of self-discovery. It's a wonderful myth. It's really, really beautiful. The idea that within us, with just covered over temporarily, is this radiant Buddha, you know, this golden figure. It can give us a real sense of confidence. The Thagatagarbha Sutra is particularly good, it said, for people who have low self-esteem, who are very hard on themselves. Yeah. And it has, we have to be a little careful with it too. So Jnanavacha, in one of his talks, he talked about going to see Bhante, and he was very inspired by a just sitting retreat, a pure awareness retreat, actually, he had been on. And he said to Bhante, Buddha nature does seem to be true, doesn't it, Bhante? And Bhante said, yes, but as long as you don't take it literally. Yeah, yes, it's true, but don't take it literally. So this is one of the kind of delicious paradoxes that we have to live with in the spiritual life, that something isn't necessarily literally true, but it has a dharmic truth. Yeah, so self-discovery is dharmically true in a certain way, but we can't take it literally. But the wonderful thing about this myth is that our good qualities aren't outside us. Our good qualities generally aren't outside us. The skillful qualities that we really admire and see in other people are there in us too. They're just covered over. They may be latent, but all they're doing is they're waiting for us to get out of the way so they can shine forth. And all we need to do is stop doing greed, hatred, and delusion, and these qualities will naturally shine forth. So we're lacking nothing. We're lacking nothing, except maybe the courage to be open, to be deeply open to our depths.